Hey guys, Pastor Ben here with another review and reflection. Today I want to talk about a book I just finished reading this morning called Christian Basics: Beginnings, Beliefs, and Behavior, written by John Stott. So many of you may be familiar with the name of John Stott. He was a leader in the evangelical party within the Church of England in the 20th century, very influential figure. Had close relations and with a number of other influential evangelicals you may be familiar with, J.I. Packer, Martin Lloyd-Jones, although of course they don't all see eye to eye on every issue at all points. But John Stott is a very well-known author and pastor and leader within evangelicalism generally speaking, kind of on both sides of the Atlantic, especially in the English-speaking world, and specifically within the Church of England. And about 30 years ago, he wrote this book called Christian Basics. What I have here is the second edition. I think they came out with a third edition a while ago as well, so I haven't looked at either the first or third edition, so this is just my review of the second edition. But I picked this up because it's a book that looked like something that would be useful for working with people at different stages, especially those who are maybe early on in their faith. Again, it's Christian Basics. And so I was excited to dive in and see what John Stott had to say. Overall, I absolutely love this book. It's a very helpful guide, and it does something that's actually pretty hard to do and makes it look pretty easy. So what is it that he's trying to do? Well, he's trying to speak to a number of people in different categories. This is a book that you could put in the hands of someone who is maybe been exposed to Christianity, but is not sure if they're a Christian yet, or maybe is not a Christian but wants to know what is it exactly that Christians believe. And you could hand them this book and it could work well in that kind of almost evangelistic context. In part because Stott begins by talking about what does it mean to be a Christian and how do you know if you are a Christian. Just some of those kind of basics of how do you begin your Christian walk. But of course, he goes beyond that as well to talk about not only how to begin being a Christian, what is the gospel, how do we know if we're saved, those types of questions, but also diving in more deeply into what is it that Christians believe, what's the doctrinal content of the faith, and then how does that belief express itself in behavior? What exactly does it mean to live as a Christian, not just to become a Christian, but to believe as a Christian and to go on as a Christian, how to behave in those different ways. And so it's something that, again, you could hand to someone who is not yet a believer but is wrestling with the faith, and it would be helpful for them. I think it probably has most in view someone who is a new believer, or maybe not a new believer in the sense that they just became a Christian, but maybe there's someone who became a Christian years ago but hasn't gotten a real grasp of the basics of the faith. And so they need to grow as a Christian, even if they may have been a Christian for a long time. And then I'll just say this, as someone who has been a Christian for as long as I can remember and is a Christian pastor now as well, this is a book that was really helpful and encouraging to me because it's just going back to the basics of the gospel. And it's interesting for me to see as well how Stott chooses to kind of articulate the faith. And, I think one of the things that people have found very helpful about John Stott's ministry, whether it's his writing ministry or his speaking ministry down through the years. Of course, he's passed away now. He passed away in 2011. But his long ministry was marked by an ability to communicate complex things in a very digestible and clear way. And he really uses those skills well with this book. Again, it's something that someone who is new to the church and new to the faith could pick up and understand, and yet someone who is a seminary professor could pick up and profit from, because you're just seeing how he explains things, how he connects things, and it's very, very well done. So what all does he cover in this book? Well, again, it's something that is kind of written for a wide range of people, but I think maybe the context he has most in mind is like a new members class or an inquirer's class. So if you had, a Sunday school, or you're meeting with someone who is just beginning their Christian walk and they want to join the church, they want to become part of God's people, but they don't know what that looks like. This is a book that you could go through with someone and it would really be a help to them. There's a couple of features that make this book helpful. One, I think just the structure of it. Christian beginnings, Christian belief, Christian behavior, very comprehensive but basic approach to thinking through these things. And he deals in that first section. I'll just kind of go through the headings so you can see where he's going with this book. With Christian beginnings, he starts with the question in chapter 1, how do you become a Christian? So he talks about how to become a Christian, what is the gospel, what does it mean to make that your own? A very helpful chapter. Second, how to be sure you are a Christian, how to have that gift of assurance, what that means, some of the false assurances we can have at times, and just a good way of grounding you in the gospel so you know what you have believed. You have confidence that God is at work and that he'll bring that work to completion. And then progressing very naturally, he says, how do you grow as a Christian? So again, being a Christian is not just about some crisis moment or conversion at some point in the past. It's about an ongoing life of faith. How do you grow in those things? And so he begins to introduce that. And I love the fact that where he goes from there is not just to talk about Christian behavior, which might be how we often think of it. You need to believe the right things and, come to faith, and then here's all the things for you to do. Before he gets to that behavior, he has 3 chapters on Christian belief. And I love the way that he frames this belief as well, because what he does is to have a chapter on each of the persons of the Godhead. So chapter 4 is belief in God the Father. Chapter 5, belief in Jesus Christ. Chapter 6, belief in the Holy Spirit. And that's not where a lot of people start when they talk about what do we believe as Christians. But I think Stott is exactly right to put his finger on that and say, if you want to know what it means to be a Christian, you need to understand the Trinitarian nature of our faith. Now, of course, he's doing that in a way that's appropriate for young believers. So he's not diving into all the ins and outs of Trinitarian controversies and terminology and all of that, but he's using that approach of looking at God the Father and all that that means. So talking about God's creation, God's sovereignty, God's promises, God's purposes, that's all tied up in the work of God the Father. And then thinking about God the Son, the work of Jesus Christ, not only getting right his character and nature, but understanding the work that he's done for us on the cross, the nature of the gospel, the nature of salvation, the fulfillment of all those promises which God had given in his word as well. So that's part of that chapter of understanding Jesus Christ and understanding the work that he's done. And then finally, the work of the Holy Spirit and helping us to see how the Spirit is so central in inspiring the scriptures, in applying the work that Christ has accomplished, in illuminating the scriptures for us as believers, and giving us gifts to live as followers of Christ here and now with the church in the world. So he goes beyond just kind of a talking about theology proper to how that flows out in all sorts of different areas. So it's again a very helpful approach to kind of take that Trinitarian structure and to use that to flesh out the Bible's teaching on a wide range of topics. And then only after he's talked about what does it mean to become a Christian, to begin in the faith, and what is it that Christians believe, does he then turn to Christian behavior. And he has 4 chapters here. So the first chapter under this section, which is chapter 7, is called Moral Standards. That was a really helpful chapter. He's kind of doing 2 things in that chapter. First, he starts off by talking about what is the relationship of the Christian to the law. And he kind of untangles a few things that people often get confused about. Are we under the law or not? Some people can fall into a legalism. Some people can fall into license or antinomianism. And he does a very good job of kind of cutting through that and showing biblically how believers relate to the law now. And he, of course, stresses we don't come to the law to be justified. That's not how we become right with God. Jesus has kept the law for us, right? That's part of our belief that he already talked about. But that doesn't mean that the law has no application for us. Rather, it's something that we follow as part of our sanctification, right? Becoming more like Christ, not coming to Christ for the first time, if that makes sense. And so he kind of sorts through that in the beginning of the chapter. And then what he does is to just walk through the 10 Commandments and have a brief exposition of each of the 10 Commandments to show how they relate to the Christian life. And he's following a well-worn path there. Again, that's something that as the church has thought about, how do you disciple someone? How do you catechize someone? What does someone need to know and believe and understand to be a Christian? They cover the same things that Stott is covering. Belief in the triune God, belief in those things not just as an abstract doctrine, but as a personal faith. And then the 10 Commandments as kind of the code of Christian life, rightly understood. And he has a very helpful discussion of that. One thing he does in that chapter that was interesting, I had not come across this before, is he makes the argument that, he makes the argument many people have made, which is that, in the New Testament, Matthew 22, for example, where Jesus summarizes the law and the prophets, how does he do that? He says, well, you can summarize all of God's law this way. You shall love the Lord your God, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself. So love of God, love of neighbor is kind of the division of the law. You can think of kind of the vertical dimension and then the horizontal dimension. Well, a lot of people have seen that as mapping onto the Ten Commandments very helpfully. Traditionally, though, people tend to kind of view the first 4 commandments as being about love of God, and then the last 6 being about love of neighbor. Stott actually argues that, at least from one perspective, you could put the 5th commandment under that love of God, because it's really about, at its heart, our submission to authority, our relationship to authority. And of course, it has applications to how we deal with our parents, how we deal with government, how we deal with bosses or employers. But those people have authority as a delegated authority. And so he says, he sort of makes the argument, really we should look at those first 5 commandments as our duty to God. And that's, the first half of the law. And then the second half, those last 5 commandments are about our horizontal duty. I don't know that I would die on that hill, but I thought that was an interesting point to make, to at least introduce that idea in talking about the 10 Commandments. But that's really what he's doing in chapter 7, walking through our relationship to the law and then the 10 Commandments in particular. From there, chapter 8, he talks about Bible reading and prayer. How do you do it? Why is it important? Very helpful chapter. Chapter 9, he talks about fellowship and the Lord's Supper. I thought that was a very good chapter. That's a hard thing to do, to try to talk about what does the Lord's Supper mean, because that's been one of the big controversial issues in the history of the church. But he does a very good job, first, of framing that in the context of our relationship with the church, right? So there's no such thing as a Lone Ranger Christian, and he makes that point very well and very strongly, and then talks about how the Lord's Supper is both an evidence of that and an impetus for that unity. And he goes through 4 things that the Lord's Supper does, being a remembrance, being a participation, a communion, right? Being a thanksgiving, and being an example of fellowship and unity. And he does a good job there, I think, of kind of cutting across some of the divisions to show what holds, especially for Protestants. He's writing as a Protestant, what Protestants hold in common in our belief about the Lord's Supper, which is important because sometimes we can exaggerate the differences as if we don't believe anything the same about the Lord's Supper, and that's not the case. There's a lot of common ground there. And then he ends chapter 10 with a chapter on the service of Christ, and he kind of talks about 5 ever-expanding circles, concentric circles of ministry, and how not only pastors and missionaries are called to be involved in ministry, but ordinary Christians as well, all of us. He talks about how that manifests itself in the home, and in our church, in our workplace, in our neighborhood, in our world, and just kind of how that work of the gospel expands. So he does all of that in about 180 pages. At the end of every chapter, he has some questions you can ask, promises, scriptures to look at or meditate on, extra things you could dive into, things you could do in a group, suggestions for further reading. So again, this is really laid out well for handing to a new Christian, or going through in a class, or using in an inquirer's class. So overall, very, very helpful book. I really love this and will be using it and recommending it. There's just a couple of caveats I would give. So first one, just with the second edition, I don't know when exactly this second edition was published. The book was originally published in 1991. It's about 30 years old. This book, some of the graphics and things definitely look a little bit dated. So, that's kind of cosmetic, but just something to kind of be aware of as you're thinking about using the book. More substantially, there are a few points where I would disagree with where Stott is coming from or what he says. Probably the biggest one that comes to my mind is when he talks about God the Father and our belief there. He rightly grounds our understanding of creation in our belief in the work of God the Father, right? I believe in God the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth. That's really where he's getting that from in the Apostles' Creed. But Stott kind of has this little diversion where he says, people have allowed this controversy between science and faith, and the Bible allows for evolutionary ideas, and we have to believe that God created, but we're not tied to any one way of creation. I think I know what he's getting at in trying to give us an appropriate humility and an appropriate recognition of what it is that Genesis is after, and I think it is true to say that Genesis is not primarily trying to give us a scientific account of how God made the earth. Having said that, where Genesis does speak to how God made things, what it's saying is true. And I think that's something that Stott doesn't seem to give enough weight to. Of course, Genesis is not a science textbook, but if it says that God specially created Adam, that he created, the animals on a certain day and, the birds on a certain day, then that's something that happened, right? The Bible's not telling us how all of that happened, but that account doesn't really give room for an idea of millions of years of gradual evolution where one species develops into another and humanity comes as some pinnacle of that. That's not room that the scripture gives us. I know there are Christians who hold to that, but I think it's a very flawed view. I think it opens the door for a lot of things that are very dangerous, and I disagree with Stott. And I definitely wouldn't have put that into a entry book. I know he's doing it probably apologetically, trying to address challenges, but I think the answer that he's giving there is an easy answer to a complex question. And as people have often said, for every difficult question, there's an easy and wrong answer. And I think that's an easy and wrong answer. So I disagree with that. But really, overall, I was kind of surprised. There's very little I would disagree with here. And that's saying something, because I have a great appreciation for the ministry of John Stott, but I do not agree with everything he was saying. He was a minister in the Church of England. While he was an evangelical, he would have some different views on some things famously, but he does a good job of trying to kind of present a mere Protestantism in this book. Having said that, and this is just the last thing I'll mention, he definitely does it with an Anglican accent, if I can put it that way. Meaning he will, if he's making a point, he'll often quote from Episcopal, documents or sources or figures or whatever, which is not a criticism. I would expect nothing less, and I would probably think a little less of him if he didn't do that. If I was going to write a book like this, you'd be reading a lot of stuff from Presbyterians, because that's where I'm coming from. So that's not a criticism, it's just something to be aware of. So if you're using this book, like in a new members class especially, and you're a Presbyterian or you're a Baptist or something like that, there's going to be things that I don't think there's things in terms of content that we'd really disagree with very much, but it's more just drawing from a different stream, which is not a bad thing. One of the things that I walked away with was just seeing how, in the essentials of the gospel, how united we are as Protestants. And again, sometimes those divisions get overplayed and exaggerated, but Stott's book was a helpful reminder to me of just the beauty of the gospel, the basics of the gospel, and this is a wonderful book to introduce someone to that. So if you have someone that you're working with, that you want to disciple, that wants to kind of learn more about the faith or just be grounded in their faith or join the church, this would be a phenomenal resource to consider using with them. Christian Basics, Beginnings, Belief, and Behavior by John Stott.